Well, we're self-conscious, so we know of our own existence, and we know of our own limitations. And so that means that we have a certain innate terror and fragility. Our existence is a problem to us. And in some sense, what we're trying to do when we search for meaning is to search for a solution to that problem. And that can be security, but it can also be mode of being. And so, for example, being engaged in something worthwhile seems to be a good medicine for being fragile, because you think, well, I'm doing this, it seems worthwhile, and the fact that there's a price to be paid for it and that things could befall me that aren't good, I'm willing to put up with that because what I'm engaged in seems to be of sufficient significance to justify all that. We all become self-conscious, and we're all trying to do something about that, figure out how to deal with it. So there's a landscape that we inhabit, I would say, within which that takes place. So there's a human being, self-conscious, doomed to tragedy, and doomed to be aware of that. The human being has two elements, and that's the element that seeks the good, and there's the other element that seeks, I would say, revenge and destruction. And we have our reasons. If something tragic happens to you, it's tragic and unfair, and it really brings you low, the probability that you're going to become resentful and want revenge is extraordinarily high, and no wonder. And the archetypal representation of that is evil itself, and the archetypal representation of the good that you could do is the hero. And so those things inhabit us. They're permanent elements of the human psyche. And then what else is universal to us? Well, we live in a society, you could say, and that's deep. It's not just human society. Like, we've lived in a society forever. So, lobsters live in dominance hierarchies. And they use their serotonin system, at least in part, to keep track of their dominance position. And so you can use antidepressants on lobsters when they get defeated. And they don't feel so bad from being defeated in a fight. And so you just think about that, because antidepressants do the same thing to us. We're so bloody social that the circuits that evolved 300 million years ago, when the lobsters and us had a shared ancestor, are still operating at the base of your brain. That's why status is so important to people, and reputation. I mean, that serotonin system governs your emotional regulation. How people respond to you and what they think of you, man, that matters. That's why you're on Facebook all the time and checking your texts and obsessing continually about your online presence, assuming that you're doing that, and contacting people frantically and seeing what the updates are. It's like, how are you held in the esteem of others? Very, very important, and that's because it determines your emotional regulation. It's really important. So we exist in a society, always, and the society has two elements. The tyrannical element of the society, that would be the tyrannical king, roughly speaking, a very common mythological theme. You see that in the Lion King too, right? Because that's Scar. And of course you see it in the real world with almost continually. And then the benevolent king, who is the source of all the good things about culture. And you can see these things play out as mythologies in political terms. So I would say, for example, the continual harping about the oppressive nature of the patriarchy is part of a myth. And the myth is that society is oppressive. It's like, well, yeah, obviously, because you have to be quite a bit like you, and you have to be quite a bit like you, even if you're not, so that you can get along, right? Everybody sacrifices a tremendous amount of their individuality to the common mode of being. There's a tyrannical element to that. But, by the same token, it's the basis of cooperation and the stability of society. And the final element is, that's often represented in a masculine manner, by the way, society. And I think that's because our primary dominant structures, given the creatures we are, like chimpanzees, the primary structures of dominance are masculine. And then outside of what's known is the unknown. And we always have to contend with that. And it's wonderful in that it's the source of all new things, and it's terrible in that it's the place where all the things that destabilize you come from. And so this is a good representation, although not the only one, So that's the feminine nature, that's the masculine order, and that's the individual who's destined to suffer in the grasp of those two things. And I'll finish this next time. What have we got here? Yep. All right. Good enough. We'll see you next time. You know, not everybody is equipped to or interested in engaging in high-level discussion of abstract and creative ideas. You know, you hear this idea that everyone's creative. That's a lie. It's as straightforward as that. True creativity is very, very rare. And so, and if you happen to be a creative person, or if you happen to be someone who's profoundly interested in ideas, you are in a pronounced minority, just as you are if you happen to be extremely extroverted or extremely agreeable or extremely conscientious. These are minority issues, and what you do is you find like-minded people who are capable of engaging that. You know, heavyweight weightlifters compete with heavyweight weightlifters for a reason, and everyone thinks that's fine. And the same thing applies to intellectual and creative endeavors. So what you do is you try to find a community where that's the nature of the community, and you likely have to find a relationship like that as well, you know. So I don't think so. I think what contributes to the siloing is the arrogance that goes along with it. Because if you can be interested in ideas and you can be creative, well, that's the arrogance of the intellect, right? That's the thing the Catholic Church had warned about for centuries, is the arrogance of the intellect. So because if you're wise as well as smart, and there is no relationship between being smart and being wise. They are not the same thing. There's no quick pathway from smart to wise. And many of the people who I've known who were very wise well, some of them were intellectually impaired and were still wise, you know. So it's the arrogance that brings up the block. And I see this, for example, happening in the United States in particular, because the last time I went down there, for example, I had friends down there, and some of those friends are very, very smart people, and some of them were talking about the Trump voters, and they were talking about the Trump voters with contempt. And I thought, you better watch that, because that's 50% of the damn population. And it might be convenient to think that they're stupid and beneath you, but it's not conducive to a civil state, and there's no evidence that it's true, because there isn't a straight line between intelligent and wise. And so I think that if your character is developed and you're intelligent, you can have your siloed creative community, but you develop enough wisdom so that you can see all the things that people can do that are of high ethical utility that are outside the intellectual domain. You know, and I think that's why in the New Testament, I think that's why Christ is a carpenter. Right? Because, well, first of all, a carpenter is one of those jobs that when you're dishonest, it manifests itself immediately, because what you build falls down. And so if you're an honest carpenter, you build a good house. So there's a nice metaphor there. But it's also a warning, in some sense, against the equation of intellectual brilliance with moral superiority. And so if the intellects would drop their moral superiority, and fat chance there is of that, then the divide between the working class, say, and the elite would resolve. And there's every reason to have respect for decent working class people. I mean, it's on their labor, as the left-wingers at least hypothetically agree, that the entire edifice of the culture is resting. So you can have your cake and eat it too, but you have to not assume that your niche makes you superior. And it's very difficult for smart people, especially smart. There's this scene in Nietzsche's, it's in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra, the prophet, comes down from the mountain, and he comes into a public square, and there's this crowd around this little midget who's only about this high, who has a gigantic ear, and everyone is marveling at him. Well, that's what the modern intellect is like. It's a midget with a giant, well, mouth generally, not an ear. And the being is underdeveloped, but the intellect is hyper activated. And it makes the person extraordinarily unbalanced. And it's partly because they can't compete outside the intellectual realm. And that makes them very bitter, because they tend to think, well, God, I'm so smart, everything should just come to me. It's like, sorry, that's not how the world works. And it also, that attitude is immediately evident to people that they're talking to when they talk in the manner that they talk, if they are arrogant intellectuals of that sort. You see that in, The Simpsons did a good job of that with Comic Book Guy, right? I mean, he completely useless in every possible dimension with an IQ of about 160. And it's very annoying to people who have an IQ of 160 that they can also be completely useless. But it happens a lot, so...